And we will get moving. Okay, so welcome. Hello, my name is Kira Kowal-Jett. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the community education and outreach advocate at Diverse and Resilient in Appleton, right? So we have a Milwaukee office as well, but I'm here representing our Appleton office. And today we're going to talk about ways that we can respectfully affirm the LGBTQ folks that we come into contact with in our daily work, not just folks we're serving, but also, right, fellow staff, fellow admin, et cetera, et cetera. So let's jump right in. The vision at Diverse and Resilient is a future in which lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer people in Wisconsin can thrive, not just survive, but thrive, living healthy, satisfying lives in safe and supportive communities. And then we add this addendum to our vision. It's very important for us to be very clear about the fact that we center our work on those furthest from justice and those excluded historically by systems that were not designed with us or for us. We align ourselves with the community we serve very strongly. We work for the liberation of all queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And we stand in solidarity with all movements that fight for liberation, including Black Lives Matter, Indigenous rights, immigrant rights, reproductive rights, and more. And we take very seriously that we're not free until we're all free. And we make sure to say this as often as we can because the majority of our staff and the majority of the folks we're serving are LGBTQ Black folks in particular, both here and in Milwaukee. So it's very important that we're clear about who we are accountable to. Okay, so here's our outline for today, and we are going to go fast because usually I like 90 minutes or 2 full hours to cover all of this, so we're just going to go really quick. First, we're going to talk about language and definitions, right? So something that I love about the LGBTQ community is that we are always finding new ways to describe our experiences, our societal language and terminology and grammars don't leave room for us. So we have to create new things to describe and communicate and connect with each other about what we're experiencing and how we feel. And that's awesome. And it means that the language shifts rapidly. So what some of the things that were okay to say 10 years ago are not okay to say now. There are some words that are coming into common parlance now that were unheard of, even in the recent past. So we're going to go through that and we're going to talk about the importance of pronouns as well. In our second part, we're going to talk about some of the traumas that we carry as a community, historically, collectively, and some of the barriers, that we face getting service when we need it, particularly when violence has been done to us. And then we're going to talk about practical applications. So we'll learn all this stuff, and then like, what do you actually say? What do you actually do? What do you actually put on your forms to honor and affirm LGBTQ folks coming in your door? And then hopefully, fingers crossed, we will have time for some questions in the chat at the end. So my goals for you are that you'll have a greater understanding of the unique experiences of LGBTQ folks, and you'll have those tools, right, to apply this understanding in your day-to-day work. Okay, so part one, understanding just the language and identities. So sexual orientation, we're going to talk about sexual orientation, and then we're going to talk about some gender stuff as well. So we define this as physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction to others. So it's how I feel about somebody else, right? And here are some common terms. Gay, lesbian, we tend to know those really well. Bisexual, which I'm going to define here as a person whose attraction is to more than one sex or gender. Not just men and women, and especially not just cis men and cis women, which we'll get to what that means in a minute. And if this is review for some of you, awesome, you are ahead of the game and you will know what we're talking about. But more than one sex or gender. Straight, we know what that means. Primary attraction is to members of a different sex or gender. And queer is a term that can be used to describe sexual orientation and also gender identity. It can be used when the other descriptors or the other labels don't quite fit, right? If it's not quite right. And we also use this term to describe our whole community. So we're often, you might hear the queer community or as part of the queer community. This word does have a history of being used violently, right? So I would caution you, if you yourself are not LGBTQ, if you yourself, actually more specifically, if you yourself do not identify as queer, I would avoid using the term until somebody else self-identifies, right? So if someone comes to you and says, I'm bisexual, the term that you would use talking to them or about them is bisexual, not necessarily queer, even though it's sometimes used as an umbrella term. Okay, some more common sexual orientation terms, and I say common because these identities are common, but these actual words are less well known. So that's why we're taking the time to go over them. So asexual or ace, right? A person who generally does not experience sexual attraction or has little to no desire to engage in sexual activity. So someone who is asexual may experience romantic attraction and maybe in romantic and or sexual relationships. It depends on that person, it depends on the relationship and their personal boundaries and preferences. Similar to asexual, with that same root aromantic, right? So folks who aren't experiencing romantic desire or romantic attraction. Folks can be aromantic and asexual. Folks can be one or the other. Folks can be neither, right? They're not mutually exclusive. You can be both, right? And these folks often are told, well, you just haven't met the right person yet. And that's just not true, right? It's just individually how we each are set up and designed, and that's good, right? We're all designed well. Demisexual is sometimes considered to be under the umbrella of asexual. So it describes an experience of not feeling sexual attraction to someone until you have a deep emotional connection with them, until you have deep trust with them. So, oh, my brain is like, whew, blanking right now. Some folks who are demisexual, this is what I was going to say. Some folks who are demisexual also identify as asexual or aromantic. Some folks don't, right? So again, this is a moment for us to really just use the terms that the person we're speaking to uses for themselves, right? Rather than saying, oh, well, it's kind of the same thing. Well, just it's kind of the same thing. I can say whatever, right? We want to be specific, and that's part of how we honor people's experience, is showing them that we're listening and that we understand that their experiences are unique. And then pansexual, right? Pan from the Greek meaning all, which we're going to define as an attraction to others regardless of sex or gender. Many folks feel that pansexual and bisexual are similar, and they are similar, but we draw a distinction again because folks who are pan don't always use bi and pan interchangeably. Some folks do, right? And this issue in particular has some very strong feelings about this. So some people are like, yeah, bi, pan, whatever, queer, whatever. And some people are like, I am not pansexual, I am bisexual, I am using that word specifically for specific reasons, and we want to respect and honor that. Okay, That is sexual orientation, how we feel about someone else. Gender and gender identity is more self-focused. So gender as a category, right? We can think of like gender reveal parties where people like have pink balloons or blue balloons. Ideally, no one gets hurt, but sometimes people like to blow things up during these parties, and they can be very dangerous. But this is one example of how even before we're born, society is going to place us into one of two boxes, the blue box or the pink box. And those boxes um, are basically a set of characteristics of societal expectations for how you're supposed to act. You're supposed to be strong if you're a boy or a man, and you're supposed to be emotional if you're a girl or a woman. You're supposed to like trucks and dinosaurs if you're in the blue box. You're supposed to like princesses and like, I don't know, ice skating, ballet in the pink box. It's very specific, right? Um, so this is about how you behave. This is about the clothes that you wear. This is about the way you cut your hair. This can be about the way you speak. This can be about which instrument you pick up in elementary school band, right? We somehow have this idea that flutes belong to one gender and drums belong to another. And we don't often say that explicitly, but we have these really strongly preconceived notions. So gender as a concept, that's how we describe that. Gender identity, however, is your internal, deeply held sense of your own gender, which may line up with the boxes and may not line up with the boxes. So here are some common gender terms. Earlier I was saying cis, and we spell that C-I-S. It's a short version of cisgender. And you're cisgender if you came right out of the womb and the doctor said, it's a girl. And now you're an adult and you're like, I am a girl. That feels right. I'm a girl. I'm a woman. This makes sense to me. So from point A to point B, you're like, yes, this makes sense. I am what they said I was. Then you would be cisgender. The word transgender describes the experience of somewhere along that path, you're like, I am not what they said I was. They said I was supposed to be in the blue box. I'm not actually in the blue box. Maybe I'm fully out of it. Maybe I'm partially out of it, right? Whatever. But somewhere there's a like, this isn't clicking. This isn't true. So that's your sex assigned at birth when they say it's a boy, it's a girl. And somewhere along there, your sex assigned at birth isn't clicking for you. It isn't making sense. It doesn't feel true. The term non-binary is something that wasn't being used until more recently, in at least in a wide and popular sense. So this is someone whose gender identity isn't exclusively male or female. It might be both. It might be neither. It might be I don't believe in gender at all. I don't have a gender. This whole system doesn't make sense to me. I'm not using it. Sometimes folks who are non-binary will will also identify as trans or transgender. Some folks who are non-binary will not identify as trans. And again, we want to listen to the specific person in front of us about their specific experience. We have a saying in the community that if you have met one trans person, then you know one trans person, right? None of us speak for all of us. None of us are sole elected representatives, right? We carry our own unique experiences, though we often do have some things in common. Some more gender identity words that we don't have time to go over, but I encourage you to look up. They're over here on the purple circle. Gender fluid, agender, two-spirit, genderqueer, and discovering. So we really like to make room for folks who are like, I don't have a word that makes sense for my gender. because I don't really know what it is. I'm still figuring that out. And that can be true at any age. And then just a note about two-spirit as well. This word is a specific word that describes a specific experience that belongs to some of the indigenous peoples of this land. It's not a word that just anybody can grab and use for themselves. It's very culturally specific. And again, I encourage you to look more up about that. All right, so I've been saying sex assigned at birth. What does that mean? This is an assignment or a label given at birth based on some medical factors. So like hormones, chromosomes, and honestly, usually genitals. So most people are assigned male or female, and this is put on your birth certificate. You get the little F or the M. But the word intersex exists and is very important. It describes naturally occurring sex variations, including anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. There are at least 30 known variations, and intersex births account for 1 to 2% of the population. So if you know a redhead, a natural redhead, um, statistics say you also know an intersex person, which you might not know, they may not have told you. Um, they may not have been told themselves. Sometimes a surgery, a corrective surgery, is done to fix, to address aesthetic concerns of the genitalia at birth. And folks sometimes are not told until they're an adult or at all. But we claim intersex identities as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And we want to make sure that we know that even those boxes, some folks will say, well, there's like biologically, there's only two sexes. There's actually not, right? And I'm sure a bunch of you already know this. And then right here is the intersex flag over on the side. All right, gender expression, different from gender identity, right? I know we have all had days, this is so surface level, where maybe on the inside we were feeling some type of way and on the outside we acted a different way, right? Similar concept, but at a much deeper level, right? So our gender expression is how we present our gender with our name, our pronouns, our clothing, our haircuts, behaviors, our voice, and other characteristics, right? Excuse me. And that can line up with how we feel internally. It can be completely different from how we feel internally. And gender expression does not tell us how folks feel internally. We cannot guess how someone identifies based on how they look, or based on how their voice sounds, or based on their interests. We have to listen to them respectfully and then believe them when they tell us. All right. Actually, I'm going to go back really quick. Usually, if we had more time, what I would have you do is consider in your work and personal spheres, how many folks around you are folks who have an internal gender identity that lines up with their gender expression, right? How many, often when when I'm talking with groups of advocates at domestic violence shelters, many of those staff folks are cisgender women. And I just like to point out that when the whole staff is expressing in a way that fits in the box that they were given at birth, it can be hard for any staff people and any clients who are walking in to not feel that pressure to somehow conform as well, right? To feel like the odd one out. So I encourage you in your own time to consider in your personal spheres, especially in places where you work and where you're serving others, what does your team look like? How does your team identify? And how might that affect the people walking in to work with you? All right, let's talk about pronouns. Pronouns are a very hot button subject right now, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about why this is important. And not just casually important, but of the utmost importance, right? So pronouns, grammatically, they refer to the person you're talking about, and they're part of someone's gender expression. So we know that folks get very particular about the pronouns of their dogs, right? So if you're walking on the street and you're like, oh my gosh, what a good boy, look at that dog, because you see a dog and you're petting the dog, that owner might be like, her name is whatever, right? People get very particular about that because we understand that it's about gender. It's not just a word, it's not whatever, it's about gender. Um, this is part of how we honor the LGBTQ folks in front of us, right? And around us. So people can have multiple sets of pronouns for themselves. They might use he, him, and they, them. And they might use neo pronouns, right? And if someone shares with you that they use neo pronouns, um, that's going to be, there will be a learning curve for you. And also remember that that is a huge sign of trust, right? Because neopronouns, I encourage you to Google this. Neopronouns are ridiculed, right? So if someone is going to share with you that they use something other than he, they, or she, that's going to be a sign that they trust you. And the last thing about pronouns here is that they're not preferred, right? It's not like I prefer this, they are required. It's not like I like to have some tea instead of coffee. It's not a preference, right? Um, Not using them causes harm. Using incorrect pronouns causes harm. So they're not preferred, but required for respectful and affirming communication. Okay, so why though? Like why should we do this? This is from UW Milwaukee's LGBTQ Resource Center. When someone is referred to with the wrong pronoun, it can make them feel disrespected, invalidated, dismissed, alienated, or dysphoric, often all of the above, right? And depending on your line of work, you might have folks walking in the door who don't feel like that on a daily basis. And so it might be extremely hard for them to suddenly feel all of these things, to feel so disrespected and invisible. I know that here at the Appleton office, we work with folks who have survived or are surviving violence, right? So they often already feel disrespected, invalidated, dismissed, et cetera, et cetera. So it is even more urgent that we use the proper pronouns for that person because it can have a huge impact on their mental health, right? All major professional American psychological and psychiatric associations recognize that inclusive language usage for LGBTQ plus youth and adults, which is to say the entire community, right, drastically decreases experiences of depression, social anxiety, suicidal ideation, and other negative mental health factors. And this is so easy. This is so easy, right? This is one of the easiest things that we can do to affirm folks who are struggling and are statistically more likely to struggle, right? LGBTQ folks have upsettingly, disturbingly high instances of mental illness and mental distress, right? Um, and that is really hard to address. That is a complicated issue. But if we can use the proper pronouns, like that is one thing that is really, really easy. That's a really, really easy thing that we can do just to boost the person and respect the person that's sitting in front of us. Okay, so we know the famous saying, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. This is Dr. Maya Angelou. This is her saying. And this is a great use of the singular they, right? One of the arguments we can hear sometimes is that, well, they, them for a single person is grammatically incorrect. Um, But I have to say, Dr. Angelou, also Shakespeare, also Chaucer, right? Some of the folks who are lifted up as the greatest writers ever in the English language have used the singular they. So I personally feel like until we're at that level of fame and um, like until we're that lauded, we can just like follow their rules. I'm okay to listen to Dr. Angelou about grammar, right? I'm okay to listen to Shakespeare about grammar sometimes. All right. So what if I make a pronoun mistake? You will. You likely already have. But you definitely will make a pronoun mistake. That's because you're human and you're learning something new, and making mistakes is part of learning something new. So when this happens, apologize as soon as you realize it. And that might be right there in the moment. It might be a day later. Whenever you realize it, apologize right away, correct yourself, right? So if I was talking about my mom, I could say, oh, my mom just texted me and sorry, she, right? You might have a moment of getting it wrong, but really take the time, think about it, correct yourself, and then move on in the conversation, right? Because sometimes if we get it wrong and then make it this huge thing about how bad we are, then that person has to make us feel better. And that's not fair. That doesn't make any sense, right? Um, and then be proactive next time. So we want to practice every day. You can stand in the grocery line, and if you have someone in your life who uses they, them pronouns and you don't understand, just stand in the grocery line in Woodman's and go, they, them, they, them, they, them, they, them, and picture their face in your head, right? Practicing on the person doesn't work, right? Figuring out all our mistakes on that person when they're right in front of us doesn't work. And there's only so many apologies that we have room for, right? Because if I get it wrong every single time and say sorry and then correct myself, it shows that I'm not thinking about it, I'm not prioritizing it, and I am causing that person to feel that disrespected feeling every single time, right? We want to make it like 2 times, make the mistake maybe twice, and then never again. All right, that's part one. That's usually the longest part. We're going to zoom through the rest of this. Trauma and barriers. So we're going to talk about some recent LGBTQ history, workplace discrimination, health disparities, hate violence, harm from service providers, some current legislation, and the internalized response that might come in reaction to all of these things. Okay, so pre-1960s. If you have heard of the term Stonewall or the event Stonewall, this is that time. So leading up to that point, there were laws criminalizing queer and trans identities, criminalizing dressing in the quote unquote wrong clothes, right? You had to be wearing 3 items of clothing that were connected to your gender assigned at birth, or you could literally be arrested. And after that arrest, right, that you can be outed in the newspaper, you could lose your job, you could be divorced. Like there were all of these things that could happen to you. Your life could be completely over. Legal discrimination across public and private sectors, and homosexuality and transness, right, were thought of as mental illnesses. You could be institutionalized against your will for expressing your identity. And Stonewall was a reaction to that, right? Stonewall was an uprising against that. In the 1980s, all the way up through the 2000s, all the way up, frankly, there's still a really strong stigma. Our community was faced and devastated by AIDS and HIV, and a whole generation of us died due to neglect, due to anti-LGBTQ bias. Many people, including legislators, many of them believed that it was punishment from God for our choices, that we were to die in this way, that we were to get so sick and die. And we held die-ins on Capitol steps across the country as resistance, where people would literally go in their final moments and die in public places to make that statement that we deserve equitable healthcare access. A huge part of the push for marriage equality was a result of this medical discrimination because folks would have to be alone, and then their remaining living partners would be left without the home. Sometimes they would be completely shut out of any ceremonies afterwards, funerals, wakes. You know, it was really bad, right? I encourage you to look more into that history if you're unfamiliar with it. So a huge generation of us died, and this is part of why folks think that being LGBTQ is like a trendy young person's thing, because our elders are gone, right? Our elders were decimated. And currently today, all of this anti-LGBTQ legislation across the country, famously, as featured on SNL, there was the Florida Don't Say Gay bill. And now Alabama is not the only one criminalizing trans health care. Several states are doing this. Countless bills about sports and bathrooms and threats to gender affirming reproductive care. And this is not just at the state level, this is also at the county level and the district and city level. It is in our schools, and it's not great. Okay, pivoting a little bit, workplace discrimination. 46% of LGBTQ folks in the US are closeted, meaning they have not told their coworkers and bosses that they are LGBTQ. 59% of straight cis employers believe it's unprofessional to discuss sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace. We know that's not actually true, because if you say, I got married over the summer, my new name is Mrs. This, here's a picture of my husband, we are talking about both sexual orientation and gender identity, right? If you are throwing a gender reveal party, or if you're going to have a baby or someone in your office is going to have a baby and you're like, do you know if it's a boy or a girl yet? That is discussing gender identity in the workplace. It's really only when LGBTQ folks do it that people have a reaction and call it unprofessional. Health disparities, right? So not just the stress at work, not just the stress of the traumatic histories that we bring, but we often get insufficient and incomplete sexual education, which means that we cannot keep ourselves effectively safe from predators, from STDs and STIs, and we do not have language to describe when we have been sexually assaulted. Housing insecurity is a huge contributor to health disparities. If you don't have a warm, safe place to sleep at night, your body is going to tell you that, right? And pretty quickly, too. Medical discrimination, right? How many folks walk into their doctor's office and are greeted with the wrong name, the wrong pronouns, are denied access to assisting or seeing their long-term partners because of complicated marriage laws, which are also currently still under attack, and being outright denied care, right? Like, oh, you're this, we won't check you for that, right? Because clearly this happens especially with trans folks. Your body's not what I expected it to be, so therefore I'm uncomfortable, so therefore I'm not going to run the tests that you seem to be wanting. I'm not going to look that closely about the problems that you're coming in and telling me that you have, which leads people to just not go to the doctor anymore, right? So then we have these like long festering medical issues that could have been fine if they were caught earlier, but a lifetime of that builds up. And then social exclusion and isolation. We know that loneliness is literally deadly. Statistically, we know that loneliness literally kills. and our community is very vulnerable to being socially isolated, to being kicked out of our homes, to having no contact or reduced contact with our families of origin. And that loneliness um, compounds over time. Hate violence, right? We're going to define that. I think this is the FBI's definition. Any of various crimes, such as assault or defacement of property, when motivated by hostility to the victim as a member of a group. One really high profile example of this more recently was the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016. And in the previous few decades, the murders of Brandon Teena and Matthew Shepard. But we know this happens all the time, and this is happening right now in the state of Wisconsin. A handful of our clients right now, we're working with them after they have experienced hate violence because of their LGBTQ identity. And one person experiencing that is too many, but to have several is demoralizing, right? We like to think it happens somewhere else, but it does happen here in Wisconsin in our area. And then ongoing harm from service providers, right? So when folks are experiencing all of these hardships, they walk in somewhere and then folks are like, kind of want to give them the runaround, kind of want to like be wishy-washy about things, kind of want to send them to a different, like maybe somewhere else can help you with that. Misgendering folks and dead naming folks, right? If you haven't heard the term dead naming, it is using the name that someone was assigned at birth that they no longer use or identify with. And this is hard because sometimes you have to put it on legal forms if it's still your legal name. But when that's on a form and then the people who you want to help you keep calling you that, it makes you not want to go back to them for help. Folks, I see this particularly in shelter organizations, be that housing or domestic violence, downplaying the bias and the risk in shelters, in their own shelter and in other shelters, saying, oh, we could just send you over to somewhere else. Like, have you tried that place? Without realizing that that can be very dangerous. Arbitrary push out, right? I worked somewhere once where folks were often told, well, yeah, it's Christmas Eve, but they'll be fine. We can send them out on Christmas Eve. They could pack up their stuff and leave, right? Not for any reason, but just because folks feel like it. And then no understanding of the street risks, especially for our youth. When our youth are houseless, they are, I'm trying to remember the number of hours. I think it's something like 40 hours. Statistically, it's 40 hours until they get into survival sex work. And that's horrifying, right? That's horrifying. And we have to remember, especially as providers, that like saying, oh, they'll be fine for a night or they'll be able to figure it out is extraordinarily dangerous. Okay, current legislation. I actually am going to skip this for time, but I really encourage you to look this up because it is pressing and urgent, and we need you in this work to help protect our youth in particular, right? Folks have seen the power of wiping out an entire generation of LGBTQ folks, and now they're starting younger, right? And that is something that we have to resist to protect our young people. All right. And then when we have all of this violence, all of this bias, all of this neglect coming towards us, we can internalize that and say, well, maybe it's something about me. Maybe it's something about us that makes them treat us this way, right? We internalize that. Instead of saying, you're wrong, I am deserving of respect, especially if we're facing this constantly and from a young age, we start to feel like maybe it's our fault, right? And so I like to point to Audre Lorde, who is just, if you don't know who Audre Lorde is, again, look her up. She's incredible and has contributed countless. It's hard to quantify how amazing she is. But she has this famous quote: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," which is very important for us as LGBTQ folks to remember, um, that the way of thinking that causes violence to us will not set us free, right? Internalizing it and believing that we deserve violence will not stop the violence. And that's some deep soul work that we as a community are continually having to do of um, in the face of some of this really horrible stuff. Okay, um, so that was a really fast trauma and barriers, and now we're going to talk about what to actually do with the information that you have so far. And we have about 15, 16, 17 minutes to do that, and then have questions, and I think we will be able to make it. Okay, so you have all this information now about LGBTQ stuff, and sometimes it is easy to get into a headspace of, well, I'm an ally, right? LGBTQ folks should tell me, like, I'm trustworthy. I know because I went to this webinar and I Googled all these things. And so now I know so much more than I did before. They should trust me. And it's great that you're all here. It's great that you're all going to go home and Google all of the things, right? But rather, and it is an individual's right to disclose, and individually we make the decision to disclose based on safety, based on comfort, and based on relevance, right? So if I'm in the checkout line at Woodman's and the person says, "Have a nice day, ladies," to myself and my partner, it's not comfortable. I'm not a lady. That doesn't make sense to me. But it's like not worth the fight. And that's me personally. Some folks will pick that moment to correct somebody, and that is perfectly valid. Each individual is going to make a different choice in a different situation, right? Sometimes correcting someone could get you physically hurt. Sometimes correcting someone or even coming out in the first place about who you are might not get you hurt, might not get you fired, but might make it extremely uncomfortable forevermore in the situation in which you've just come out. And so folks will decide, like, it is not worth this discomfort. It is not worth having to constantly be correcting and educating other people, especially if it's not their job, right? So it's an individual's decision to disclose. If they do disclose to you, that's a sign of profound trust, right? And that's not something to take lightly, and that's not something to feel entitled to. It's a gift. So LGBTQ survivors may have, and I say survivors really broadly here, right? So many of us have experienced so many different types of violence that even if we don't necessarily identify all of those things as violence, even if we don't personally identify as a survivor, we have experienced some things, right? So LGBTQ survivors may have experiences of discrimination or violence, estrangement from family and friends, and trouble or fear accessing social supports based on not only the choice to disclose, but also being outed, being discovered, and then having your identity told to someone else or a bunch of other people without your consent. That can be very scary, and that will stop us from disclosing again. One of the things that can happen when we disclose or when we are outed is that we'll experience microaggressions. And this actually happens whether we're telling people who we are or not. Microaggressions are commonly understood to mean a subtle show of bias that is small and accidental. However, it's a privilege to decide that someone else's experience of violence is micro, right? It might seem to us like, oh, it's no big deal. Why are you so upset? If it's the 20th time that that's happened this week, it wears on a person. It really wears on a person. So microaggressions are painful, constant, and cumulative. And I encourage you to even drop the micro, right? And when talking about this, say, yeah, that was an aggression. That was not okay that someone did that to you. Or that was not okay that someone did that to me. We don't need to minimize for ourselves either. Remember, the LGBTQ staff see how you treat LGBTQ clients or coworkers and will act accordingly to keep themselves safe. I see this all the time in schools. I see this all the time in advocacy agencies, right? That folks will often choose to not come out because they see somebody else treating an LGBTQ client or student disrespectfully or dismissing the issue. Like, oh, these kids today, they all want to be they them. Like, da da da. If you're a teacher and you're they them, you're like, I'm not talking to that person, right? Or folks will swing all the way to the other end and go above and beyond, working a bunch of extra unpaid hours and doing a bunch of extra emotional labor, not only to protect those people, but also to educate everyone around them. And neither of those things is great. All right. So, what do we actually say when we're meeting someone? If we're ever in a position to do intake, right? If there's a new person joining the team, we want to get to know them. We want to leave our questions very open. Who are the important people in your life? Do you have a significant other? Are you in a relationship? Rather than, do you have a boyfriend? Are you married? Right? These can be we put folks in a position to have to say no and then disclose to us immediately. You can openly say, do you have a significant other? That's gender neutral language. Do you live with anyone? Right? If we're looking for more information about what their home situation is like, students, clients, patients, do you live with anyone? And even better, tell me more about yourself, very general. And then those people can tell you what they feel is important about themselves without us needing to push very hard, right? And it gives those folks, you could say, are you in a relationship? And if folks are in a complicated situation, they might not want to say anything. So if you say, tell me more about yourself, they have the opportunity to avoid that topic altogether until you have the trust built, right? That they would want to share that with you. This is an example of our form, our intake form. Just so a few of the things that we have in our intake form. So we say our client name, we ask how they pronounce their name, and what name they want us to call them if it's not this first name. And then we ask for pronouns, optional. And then gender, not necessarily your sex assigned at birth. We say male, female, non-binary, and then not listed. Instead of saying other, right? Instead of saying like, these are the people who count, you're just something else. We say not listed, and in doing so, we're like, we didn't think to put you on our list, right? That's on us. That's not a problem about you. That's our list that doesn't have enough room, and we always have the option prefer not to say. And then we also separate, because remember, gender identity does not necessarily tell us if someone is trans or not, or under the trans umbrella. So we say, do you also identify as intersex, transgender, two-spirit, or again, not listed? Because what we understand is that trans women, for example, are women. So for gender, you would put female. And then if that person wants to tell us that they transitioned however long ago or are mid-transition right now, then they can. And they also don't have to if they don't want to. Okay. Names and pronouns. Use a person's chosen name regardless of legal documentation. With consent, especially if you're working with um, patients or clients or students, um, you can place that in a record where your full team can see it so that they don't have to like have this conversation every single time, right? You can share it with transfers of information. Alternately, that person might say, I am coming out to you and only you, do not tell anybody else. I will come out to them when I feel good and ready and when there's trust there. And then you don't put it anywhere, right? You let them move on their own timeline. You want to leave space for pronouns on forms without requiring them because that can force someone to lie on the spot or have to out themselves unexpectedly. So we keep that optional. Here are a couple phrases that are hurtful. You don't look gay. You don't look trans. Or the related one that is like, she's even prettier than me, right? Sometimes we get this comparison of cis women and trans women in particular, like, she's even prettier than me, um, as if it's surprising that trans women would be aesthetically attractive, right? So we don't want to act surprised about that. Or you're too pretty to be a lesbian, right? Or you're too masculine to be gay, like you're too this thing to fit the stereotype. We want to avoid statements like that. In same gender relationships, we want to avoid asking who's the this in the relationship. Often the point is that neither person is the this, right? Neither person is the man or neither person is the woman in the relationship. And we're never going to ask about someone's genitals unless it is absolutely medically necessary, right? Um, if you would not ask a straight or cisgender person the question about genitals that you are wanting to ask a trans person, don't ask it. Um, Other hurtful things, assuming someone's identity, especially based on the way they look or act, referring to being LGBTQ as a choice or a lifestyle. I am an LGBTQ vegan. One of those things is a lifestyle choice. One of those things is not, right? Um, Ignoring gender neutral programs because they're pronouns because they're too hard or grammatically incorrect. We've covered that. And then assuming someone is sexually abnormal. This is a subtle bias that can show up. Assuming that especially like gay men just want to have sex all of the time, that they're hypersexual, assuming what someone's sex life or sexual drives or desires might be based on their identity is something that we just want to avoid. Helpful things that we do want to do and provide: single stall, gender neutral bathrooms on every floor for everyone that are wheelchair accessible. We want to make sure, as much as is in our power, to either make that happen or talk to the people who have the power to make that happen. You want to ask, listen, and adjust based on feedback from LGBTQ employees, coworkers, friends, family members, patients, clients, students. We want to always be absorbing and shifting to be more respectful, to be more affirming, more welcoming in our spaces without getting defensive about it. We can't know everything, right? Sometimes we just don't know. And we want to identify other people who are doing the work to be as respectful as possible and keep ourselves accountable. We show appreciation for trust when folks come out to us. If you don't know something and it's really relevant and you're talking to an LGBTQ person, then you can just ask. If it's not relevant, look it up on your own time. And especially if you're in a position of power as a provider, as a teacher, as a whatever, have resources on hand ahead of time so that when a LGBTQ person walks in, you're not like, I better call Diverse and Resilient to get their brochures. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, right? We want to know what to do ahead of time. We want to have other resources for that person before they walk in the door. All right, we zoomed through that. I see we have one question in the Q&A. Yes, I can share my slides. Any other questions? Ooh, yes. To refer to me, yes, I would say you can give them our warm line number. You can give them, if you feel like there's a specific connection with a specific one of our staff, let that person know, and then maybe make that referral directly, depending on how that person wants. For me specifically, you can email me, and then let me know that you have given that person my contact information, um, and to expect to hear from them. All right, we do have brochures, and we can figure out how to get a good set of those, at least over to Prevea. Okay, I do have a little blurb that I need to share with all of you, about the Be Safe campaign. Okay, this is separate from my presentation. This is like conference information now. So this is a new public awareness campaign called the Be Safe campaign. It was launched a few days ago on the 18th. And this campaign seeks to enhance awareness of local domestic violence resources and is a joint effort of Golden House, law enforcement, organizations, and the Community Coordinated Response Team in Brown County. It's led by community leaders and organizations, and it seeks to reach victims and survivors by offering a free local resource, which is a phone number that you can call or click when they need help. So we invite you to visit 920-212-SAFE.com for more information, or share the number with someone needing support. That's 920-212-SAFE. And it is amazing what happens when we come together to help address social determinants of health. I strongly encourage you to look up violence as a determinant of health, or go to the other great sessions about it that are happening today. Thank you so much for attending. There's going to be a really quick poll on the screen. So go ahead and take the poll. It's just 2 questions. And I hope you have a great day.